On this week's 51%, we speak with writer, activist, and historian Dr. Felicia Kornbluh about her book, A Woman's Life is a Human Life, chronicling her mother's role in the movement to decriminalize abortion in New York in the years leading up to Roe v. Wade.
Within about 5 years from when they started campaigning, they won.
Dr. Kornbluh also shares what today's abortion rights activists can learn from those early movements now that Roe has been overturned. I'm Jessie King. It's all up next on 51%.
I was standing around like one of those girls I had seen in a movie. The whole world was a movie back then. I had my sunglasses on, I wanted to be seen without seeing shy Lolita. I wasn't really in it, I didn't really get it.
You're listening to 51%, a WAMC production dedicated to women's issues and experiences. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Jessie King. January 22nd marks what would have been the 51st anniversary of the Supreme Court decision Roe v. Wade. That is, of course, if the landmark decision granting constitutional protection for abortion hadn't been overturned almost 2 years ago. Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization essentially returned the abortion debate back to individual states, creating the complicated landscape that we see now, where at least 21 states outright ban or heavily restrict abortion, while others are working to protect the procedure and others still are locked in legal battles over it. Last month, state Supreme Courts in at least 3 states heard arguments on abortion cases that could further restrict the procedure out west, including a case involving multiple local bans passed in New Mexico. The U.S. Supreme Court has announced it is taking up 2 more cases related to abortion this year. Our guest today will have more on that in a bit. Dr. Felicia Kornbluh is a professor at the University of Vermont who specializes in the histories of feminism, gender, disability, law, and reproductive justice. She has 3 books under her belt, and her latest is A Woman's Life is a Human Life: My Mother, Our Neighbor, and the Journey from Reproductive Rights to Reproductive Justice. You see, for Kornbluh, the history of the country's abortion debate is also family history. Her mother played an integral role in the movement to decriminalize abortion in New York State in the years leading up to Roe v. Wade. Kornbluh says she's always known her mother's work to an extent, but it wasn't until her mother died that she really started digging into her story and saw how much it relates to what some activists, including Kornbluh herself, are still fighting for today. I recently sat down with Dr. Kornbluh to learn a little bit about that story and to pick her brain ahead of Roe's anniversary.
Well, my mom, interestingly, she was not a big radical, at least not the way we usually think of somebody who's radical. You know, she was a lawyer. She sort of fought her way from an immigrant working class family into law school. But by the time I came along, you know, she was a professional who was pretty well established, worked for the federal government. But she was, first of all, really committed to the Democratic Party and to a vision of the Democratic Party that was liberal. It was, you know, liberal in the 1930s, kind of Franklin Roosevelt or Eleanor Roosevelt sense of the thing. And that was what first inspired my mom to get involved. And then as a liberal and as a Democrat and somebody who wanted the Democratic Party to represent a kind of pro-civil rights, pro-labor, pro-working class kind of point of view, she then got turned on by this new thing, which was a civil rights movement for women, which my mother thought was just the neatest thing in the world when that came along in the 1960s. And she was an early member of the National Organization for Women, which was created to be a civil rights organization for women. And it was as part of that organization, part of NOW, that my mom joined the Abortion and Contraception Committee of the New York City chapter, which is their first local chapter. And she drafted the bill that ultimately decriminalized abortion in the whole of New York State. And actually, the first draft of that law, the one that my mom wrote, was much more progressive than what the state of New York ultimately passed. In fact, it was more progressive, more open in terms of abortion than the law that the state of New York has even today. It was a complete repeal of all restrictions, saying people could simply choose abortion if that was something that made sense to them and their families and their clergy and their doctors. They could choose it with no restrictions of any kind.
I just personally find the evolution of this issue to be really interesting. Just like the way the battle over abortion rights has changed throughout our history. We've had guests on previous episodes of this show talk about how, abortion wasn't really criminalized in our early years as a country. We didn't really see criminalization until the second half of the 19th century. And of course, the approach taken by activists on both sides of the debate has changed over time. And sometimes, the groups that you see on those sides of the debate has changed as well. So take me back about 50 years and tell me more about the approach your mother's movement was taking.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think she would be completely astounded that we are again at a time where to provide an abortion or to seek an abortion or to help your friend find an abortion provider, that could be a crime in the 21st century. That would have taken her breath away. What she was fighting for and what other people in her generation were fighting for was to decriminalize it. And the reason they use that language instead of the language of legalize it or some other kind of language is because they really understood, just like you were saying, that there was a time before it was a crime. If you go back to the 17th century, 18th century, after the American Revolution, there were no state laws. There was no legislation about abortion of any kind. There was common law, the law that was kind of inherited from England and changed somewhat in the United States. So the common law said that abortions, late term abortions, as we would call them today, were, problematic, although there were almost no prosecutions, but there was no state law about it. And it was only in the 19th century when doctors organized and advocated to put laws on the books that they created criminal penalties for providing abortion procedures. And in some states, even for the people who were seeking those abortions, they created those criminal penalties for the very first time in the 19th century. And so in the 20th century, the battle was to tear down the criminal penalties. And I think in the background, the understanding was that there was something unnecessary and kind of unnatural about criminalizing this process that this procedure that some people found necessary in their lives. So, gosh, we really need that again today.
And so how did that grow from efforts to decriminalize in New York State to a more national movement? Was the idea simply that, decriminalizing it wasn't enough to prevent things from being turned back?
Well, I think their understanding was a lot like the way a lot of us understand it today, that even if you could win in a couple of states, in a state like New York or a state like California, right, it still wasn't enough. I mostly tell the New York story, but I also give a national overview in my book. And I think they saw it as unfair, that people could have a right to a certain kind of medical procedure, medical assistance in certain states and not in all the states. That seemed wrong to them. And I think also, as you were indicating, they saw that it was very fragile. What happened in New York was the law changed in 1970. So my mom's very, very ambitious draft, was put together in late 1968, introduced into the state legislature in 69. It was watered down somewhat from my mother's draft, and it passed in the spring of 1970. But right away, the anti-abortion movement started trying to repeal what they had done in New York. And they were almost successful. In fact, it was only because there was a Republican governor, Nelson Rockefeller, who was in favor of abortion access. And he vetoed a bill that came to him from the state legislature that would have recriminalized abortion in 1972, right? And if Rockefeller hadn't done that, then it would have been game over, even in New York, right? Even in supposedly liberal, progressive New York. So I think it was the two things, the looking around the country and saying, look, this is outrageous that people have different rights depending on what state they live in. It shouldn't be that way. It should be national, not a state thing. And even in the states that were liberal, that were seen to be liberal, they saw how fragile it was. And it was very important to get a constitutional ruling. I think the court also was concerned about all this inequality from state to state. I don't know, the current Supreme Court doesn't seem to worry about that too much, but in our traditions, in our constitutional traditions, and in the way that the court usually behaves, that is problematic. People aren't supposed to have radically different rights, just depending on the locality or the state where they happen to live. And there's supposed to be some dependability. Like, that's why we're a country, a coherent country, and not just a bunch of states, right? That's the difference between having a United States and just having individual states. So I think the court was very bothered by that, and they were trying to create some national baseline. And frankly, they were trying to settle it. One of the things that's so frustrating to me is that Roe versus Wade is always described as this kind of radical, dramatic, absolute thing that is only favoring people who want to have legal abortion. It actually isn't. What happened in Roe is that the Supreme Court actually tried to balance out different interests, and they tried to stand back and say, look, people disagree about this, and that's okay. We're a diverse country in which people have legitimate political disagreements and religious disagreements and other kinds of disagreements. So what Roe actually said was that for the first 2 trimesters of a pregnancy, for the first 6 months or so, states will by and large not be able to interfere with somebody's decision making. But in the 3rd trimester of a pregnancy, there might be other considerations that are also important. And so states would be allowed to regulate access to abortion somewhat in the 3rd trimester. And that's not something I would favor, and it's not something that my mom would have favored. But what the court was trying to do is to respect the diversity of opinion in our country. And that's what Roe was really all about. And what they thought they were doing, or at least hoped that they were doing, was actually quieting the controversy, ending some of the bitterness. And of course, that's not the way it worked out.
No, it is not. Well, before we get into today's landscape, I wanted to touch on another story running through your book. You talk a lot about your mother's across-the-hall neighbor, who fought for decriminalization, yes, but really saw a need for a broader agenda for reproductive justice. To her, you say this was about more than just abortion.
Yeah. So just to underline and thank you for that, my book is called A Woman's Life is a Human Life. And then the subtitle is The Journey from Reproductive Rights to Reproductive Justice. And that language, the reproductive justice language, that's the language we use today. And it wouldn't have been the 1970s language, but it's the same kind of idea. This woman who lived across the hall from us was a pioneer in what we could call the reproductive justice movement, which says, yes, of course, safe, legal, accessible abortion, that's an absolute. It's something that people must have. But in addition to that, there are a lot of other things that people are going to need if they're going to have genuine choice or choices in their reproductive lives. If they're really going to be able to exercise their reproductive rights, then it's not going to be just about abortion, but people are also going to need to be, for example, free from sterilization abuse, which was a huge issue in the 1970s and has been an issue even more recently. And for example, in the California prison system, there was a scandal a few years ago about sterilization abuse of some prisoners. So they put that on the agenda. And that was a concern that was coming mostly out of Black communities in the South and Puerto Ricans on the island of Puerto Rico and in cities like New York, and Mexican and Mexican-American women in California, and Native American women on reservation, right? All of those groups were experiencing sterilization abuse. And this woman who lived across the hall from us, Dr. Helen Rodriguez Trias, who was herself Puerto Rican and had lived in San Juan, Puerto Rico, before she moved to New York, she said, look, this is also a reproductive rights issue. And we have to, our movement has to be able to address this just as much as we address issues about birth control or issues about access to abortion. And that was a critical expansion of the agenda. And I think it was also intellectually really critical, because people started to think in a much bigger way, like, wow, okay, so we don't just need the right to not have kids, but what if the bigger problem for some communities is that we're not allowed to have kids, right? Because some doctor says, hey, you're on welfare. You shouldn't be having kids. And so I'm going to, pressure you into having a sterilization procedure or something like that. Like, people really started to think about, okay, so we need the right to have kids as well as the right to not have kids. And what's that going to take? What would it really mean if we created a society in which everybody really had all those choices and really was able to make those decisions for themselves and their families without pressure and coercion? And that's what she stood for.
And so how did that movement evolve over the years? I think most of us know where abortion and Roe v. Wade ended up, but have those efforts to fight sterilization abuse stood the test of time? You mentioned that there's still some instances in recent years where we've seen it.
Well, interestingly, the protections that were won by Dr. Helen Rodriguez Trias and her allies, those protections have still kind of held. So we do see occasionally there's a scandal around sterilization. There was another one during the Trump years. There was one particular detention facility for migrants, an ICE detention facility, where there was a doctor who was giving people hysterectomies that they didn't want, full hysterectomies. So those scandals do arise, and I don't want to pretend that doesn't happen, but the victories that the people I write about were able to win against sterilization abuse, those victories have pretty much held up. They were able to pass legislation first at the local level in New York City, and then nationally. They didn't go to Congress, but they went straight to the federal agency that governs all healthcare matters, what used to be called the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, and today is HHS, Health and Human Services, right? And they got that department to issue new guidelines to every single hospital that takes federal money, which is basically all the hospitals. And that raised the procedures that people would have to go through, that doctors and hospitals would have to go through before they could consider somebody to have consented to a sterilization. So they made it more difficult in a way for people to consent to a sterilization procedure because they didn't want people to be pressured. So those guidelines that they got the federal government to institute, those are still on the books. And they've been somewhat quiet. People have not problematized them in the way they problematized abortion. Their bigger agenda, which is about really providing people with the kind of freedom, the economic freedom and the family freedom from intimate partner violence, and the freedom to live in great neighborhoods and have great health care and all those other things that they also wanted, which they thought would contribute to reproductive rights in the biggest sense. Like, okay, that's a bigger challenge, and they haven't won all of that stuff.
We're speaking with Dr. Felicia Kornbluh, author of A Woman's Life is a Human Life. Let's talk a little bit about where the country currently finds itself on abortion. How would you say today's movement for abortion rights is different from, say, your mother's?
That's a really great question. To be honest, I think sometimes and in some ways the debate feels a little old-fashioned sometimes, but not everywhere and not all the time. I think some people in this movement really have learned the way I wish that everybody would learn, that we need a kind of 360 movement, right? Of course, we need to fight for reproductive rights in the sense of legal, safe, accessible contraception and abortion care. Absolutely. For everyone who is pregnant or has the capacity to get pregnant, like absolutely. At the same time, we need to fight for all reproductive rights and for reproductive justice for all people. And that means, fighting for the whole agenda, an agenda that is anti-racist, an agenda that grants people access to good health care, even when they're not citizens, even when they don't have great health insurance. All those different kinds of inequality show up in the area of reproductive rights, just like they show up in every area of our lives. And we really can't afford to forget about them. And I mean, it's great that the political cause of legal abortion it's obvious now that it's a majority cause, right? That overwhelming percentages of Americans believe that we all need to have access to make that choice. But I think even bigger percentages of Americans would be on board if we created an agenda that was about reproductive justice for all people and giving people that full range of choices for themselves and their families.
The Supreme Court has said that it will take up 2 more cases related to abortion this year. Just for our listeners, clue us in a little bit on those cases and what you're keeping an eye on over the next year.
In terms of what's coming in the near-term future, people should understand that the Supreme Court is going to be deciding 2 huge cases between now and the summer. One is about mifepristone, right, which is one of the 2 drugs that's used in the medication abortion protocol. And that's medication abortion is the form of abortion that's used by more than half of people who have abortions in the United States right now. So it's a huge deal. However, people should also understand that the Supreme Court is not going to say that we have to take mifepristone off the shelf, right? So they ruled that out already. So what's at issue is, are they going to kind of second guess the Food and Drug Administration in terms of what the FDA has said about how and when people can access mifepristone? So still a big deal. They could interfere with people's lives in a big way. If, for example, they say that you're no longer allowed to do medication abortion through telemedicine, which has become very important, obviously, since COVID. They could throw a wrench in it, but it's not going to make it totally illegal. So that's important to know. And even with this current Supreme Court, they pretend that they don't care about popular opinion, but I think they do. And I think that they absolutely know how unpopular the Dobbs opinion was, and that, huge percentages of Americans are incensed by the way they interfered with the exercise of people's rights. And that's part of the reason that the Supreme Court is not going to go further. They're also going to hear this, big case about whether hospital emergency rooms, even in states with very restrictive abortion laws, have to provide life-saving or health-saving abortion care. There are really cases coming out of both Idaho and Texas. And, I don't know what they're going to do there. That seems to me just like a travesty. Like, of course, hospital emergency departments should be providing life-saving and health-saving care to people for whom abortion is the life-saving care, just like any other kind of life-saving care. But I have no idea what the Supreme Court is going to do about that, because I cannot see into their brains. So those are the biggies right now.
You mentioned at the beginning of our conversation that your mom would have been in disbelief at the overturning of Roe. And as an activist yourself, I wanted to ask you, what is your outlook for the future? What do you hope readers take away from your book?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, one of the things that I talk about toward the end of the book is what happened in New York shortly before Dobbs, right? The state of New York passed a Reproductive Health Act, and that was in 2019. That was the first time since the bill that my mom worked on in 1970 that the state of New York had liberalized its abortion law. And they were only able to do that. I mean, and New York is known to be a liberal state, but they were only able to do that because there was a massive movement at the grassroots saying again to the Democratic Party, look, you have to do better. And I think we've seen that. We saw it before Dobbs and we've seen it after Dobbs all over the country, that it's been motivated people at the grassroots who have really changed things. I mean, I live in Vermont, and you think of Vermont as a very liberal state, but we didn't have solid protections until people organized at the grassroots level. Now we have constitutional protection, not just for abortion, but for other kinds of reproductive choices, and not just for people who identify as women, but for all sexes and genders. Right? We didn't have that before. And we had it because people mobilized in every single town in the whole state, right? And so we got a reproductive liberty amendment in our Constitution. So, I don't want to be Pollyanna about it. Obviously, Dobbs was a huge, huge body blow to all of us who care about women, gender, feminism, reproductive rights. And yet, there are possibilities for organizing. And I think that what the stories in my book indicate is that when people really organize and they throw everything that they have at this issue, and they give it everything that they can, then they win. They didn't know they were going to win. My mother and her allies, they thought they were going to need to pass a constitutional amendment at the federal level in order to change abortion law. They really did. And within about 5 years, from when they started campaigning, they won, first at the state level and then the federal level. It is actually darkest before the dawn. We've already seen in many, many states, in Kansas, in Ohio, right? In lots of different places across the country, that people have mobilized, and they've mobilized successfully. And we just need to keep doing more of that.
Dr. Felicia Kornbluh is a professor of history, gender, sexuality, and women's studies and Jewish studies at the University of Vermont. She's also the author of 3 books, the latest being A Woman's Life is a Human Life, My Mother, Our Neighbor, and the Journey from Reproductive Rights to Reproductive Justice. It's out now through Grove Press, and you can find it at most major booksellers. To learn more about Felicia's work, you can check out her website. That's FeliciaKornbluh.com. One quick story before we go. Here in New York's Capital Region, the Capital District Transportation Authority is teaming up with a national nonprofit to help fight child sex trafficking. WAMC's Samantha Simmons has more.
CDTA and Protect All Children from Trafficking are partnering to educate bus operators and customers about how to identify and report sex trafficking without putting yourself in danger. The Transit Against Child Trafficking campaign is launching through a partnership with CDTA in Rio Metro Regional Transit District in New Mexico's Albuquerque-Santa Fe region. The campaign will use social media, emails, and signage to raise awareness, according to Emily DeVito, CDTA's communication manager. DeVito says drivers will also be educated on the signs of human trafficking.
Many of our customers, they might want to help, but they simply don't know how or what to look for. So when it comes to reporting, the riders are our customers. They should obviously never directly intervene just because you don't know what the situation could bring.
According to humantraffickinghotline.org, in 2021, New York was 4th in the nation for the number of reported human trafficking incidents, with more than 1,600 cases, behind Florida, Texas, and California. Regionally, only a fraction of reported cases in the Northeast are resolved. David Gwynn is a public service professor at Rockefeller College in Albany. Gwynn says it's hard to accurately measure how many people are trafficked because traffickers use legal and illegal migration to exploit others.
There are a lot of different ways that people get into trafficking. Runaway children, most of the time they're running away from abusive, families. A bad family situation. They flee and end up in an urban area where they then get preyed upon by somebody who recognizes them, recruits them, and kind of beats them into submission to become prostitute. Internationally, a lot of people get into the trafficking pipeline because they're looking for economic advancement. They're trying to, they're either fleeing a place with extreme poverty or gang violence or, family violence in their situation.
PACT CEO L'Oreal Cohen says human trafficking is not like what you see on TV.
People, when they come in contact with it, don't always know what it looks like. And honestly, there are many victims, I would say most victims, don't know they're being trafficked while they're being trafficked.
PACT uses a survivors council to more accurately depict what human and sex trafficking looks like.
We asked them, when you were on a bus, what would you have liked someone to see? And one survivor said, I never made eye contact. I was always looking at the ground. I was a teenager. Normally teenagers like to look out the window. Normally teenagers want to chat with other people. I wasn't looking at anyone, and I didn't want anyone to look at me. And it was really interesting because I hadn't actually seen posters that talked about the fact that survivors were afraid to make eye contact.
Cohen says PACT chose CDTA over other large transportation authorities because of its strong leadership and willingness to help others. Cohen adds people shouldn't be afraid to report something that seems odd, saying there's no downside in reporting something suspicious.
It's important to emphasize that you don't have to be a superhero to help disrupt trafficking. Every single one of us can play a role.
The Human Trafficking Hotline is 1-888-373-7888 or text HELP to 233-733. Samantha Simmons, WAMC News.
Thanks for listening to this week's 51%. 51% is a national production of WAMC Northeast Public Radio in Albany, New York. It's produced and hosted by me, Jesse King. Our associate producer is Jody Cowan, and our theme is Lolita by the Albany-based artist Girl Blue. Just a reminder that you can listen to 51% anytime at WAMCpodcast.org or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can stay in the loop on all of WAMC's shows by signing up for our weekly newsletter Airwaves at WAMC.org. We hope you'll join us next week, but until then, I'm Jesse King for 51%.
I was every single girl, I was nobody else, I was so sure of myself. I was 15 and a half, he was a hollow laugh. And I lost my cool somewhere along the way. The nightmare down the hallway, I had to learn how to look away. I lost my cool, no electricity, hot rain on the concrete, sweet melting little girl dreams. They said, oh, I want a big life, not a house that could have been life. Where are you taking